Here's an episode of How to Analyse Poetry from the Learning Cauldron. Today we'll be looking at Liz Lochhead's poem, View of Scotland, Love Poem. Analysing poetry involves identifying and dissecting the literary techniques that the poet has used effectively to explore the theme or themes of a poem. In her poem, View of Scotland, Love Poem, Liz Lochhead explores the themes of time passing and memories, Scottish culture and tradition, superstition, and love for culture, her mother, and her husband. The title of the poem, View of Scotland, Love Poem, is interesting to the reader immediately because it is split. And effectively what we get here is two poems for the price of one. The View of Scotland element is Liz Lochhead's own memories of Hogmanay. This is a fairly autobiographical poem. And the love aspect is effectively a love poem for her husband, although it also expresses affection for her mother and for her own culture, her Scottish culture. The first stanza opens with a very vivid image of the poet's mother down on her hands and knees. And this phrase here immediately conveys the hard-working nature of Liz Lochhead's mum, and there's a sense of admiration for her mother there as well. The setting is clearly established on the second line here with the word choice of Hogmanay. So it's the 31st of December, and that is very synonymous with Scotland. So we've setting in time and in place. And Hogmanay, of course, is the time to look back into the past over the year that's just gone, and also to look ahead to the new year that's coming. My mother, the strong M's, the alliteration there, conveys the importance of her mother to her, and there's an almost affectionate giving it elbow grease. Her mother is having to work really hard, jiffy waxing the vinyl lay, and that's the floor covering which she's polishing because people liked to get their houses in order at the end of the year ready for a fresh start. And Liz Lochhead, as ever, is keen to point out that this is not nostalgia where you yearn for the past through rose-tinted spectacles. These are memories, they're factual memories, and she's conveying them in a practical and matter-of-fact way. On the kitchen table, look at the enjambment here, a newly opened tin of sockeye salmon. Lovely sibilance there to draw attention to it. And sockeye salmon is one of the references in this poem to the luxuries that one consumed in Scotland at New Year and still does in some places. The slab of black bun, nice alliteration there, being another of them. And there's a self-deprecation here, although the family doesn't expect anyone to come because they don't consider themselves to be important, they still have to be ready just in case it happens. So there's a reference here to petticoat tales, which is shortbread, and they're fanned out on the bone china. And there's an early hint here, perhaps with the petticoat, of intimacy, because this is also a love poem, if we remember. And the bone china was the finest china, so it shows that they're making a real effort for the start of the year. And then here, italics is used, as it is another time as well, to convey another voice, in this case, her mother's voice. Last year, it was very quiet. The word choice of last year here reminds us of one of the key themes of this poem, which is the passing of time. The second stanza starts with a more familiar tone. We've had my mother, the formal my mother, in the first stanza, and now we're mums. Mum's got her rollers in, and again, this is very visual. We can see the lady with her rollers in, preparing to look smart for the new year. And she's got her good dress looked out. A nice bit of assonance here to draw attention to the importance of this. Slack across the candlewick upstairs. Candlewick was a rather nice bedspread, which was typical in the 1950s. Here we've got reference to nearly 10:30, whereas in the opening stanza it was 10 o'clock. So we can see time is passing on this evening, and the mother has not yet had a chance to get changed. She's been so busy working. Shifted is the Scots expression for changing your clothes, and the exclamation there shows a sense of urgency, slight humour, or even reproach that the mum's very aware of the fact she needs to get a move on. This then is a reference to tradition. If we're to even hope to prosper, this midnight must find us how we would like to be. And this is the idea that you had to be ready and prepared for the new year, because if you were in chaos, then that's how your year to come would be. And the importance of this part here is emphasised with the repeated short P sound and the fact that it is actually mentioned again later on in the poem. The internal rhyme and the assonance of a new view of Scotland draws attention to the title of the poem, View of Scotland. And this is a literal and metaphorical view, because the literal view is the new photo on the calendar, or the front of the new calendar, but also perhaps the change that might come to Scotland in the coming year. And the assonance again draws our attention to that calendar hanging there, waiting for time to pass. It's not allowed to be revealed until the new year has started, because that is bad luck. And this hints at the superstition, which is one of the themes in this poem. The tradition is that you mustn't put the new calendar out in view until the new year has begun. But the calendar in itself is a symbol as well. It's symbolic of time time moving on and looking forward. What Lochhead does so well in this poem is to combine the threads of the various themes. And although this stanza 3, is essentially part of the love poem aspect, it does have references to the Scottish culture, which the view of Scotland refers to. She begins by addressing her now husband as darling, so it sounds intimate and definitely more like the wording of a love poem. She refers to the fact that time has passed. It's 30 years since she was a child and taking part in the Hogmanay rituals, such as looking into a mirror. There's a tradition whereby if you look into the mirror on the 31st of December, you can tell children that they will see themselves with as many heads as there are days in the year. And of course, as it's the last day of the year, they only see one head. But she remembers these as part of her whole experience of Hogmanay. Here, italics are used once again, as they were in the first stanza, to reflect the fact that it is a different voice from the past that is speaking. And she says it's also 2 years since she and her husband, met. They were familiar strangers, and this sounds oxymoronic, and yet it's the idea that the minute they met, although they were strangers, there was something familiar because they were going to become an item. But what she points out is they didn't know that at that point, and there's a use here of we, the first person plural, 4 times within 3 lines, emphasising the togetherness there that would eventually result from this happenstance of meeting together at this Hogmanay party. The reference to the bells is once again a reference to Scottish tradition. That's when midnight strikes on Hogmanay and the new year begins. And the use of the question structure here is also reflective. She addresses him and she's asking him, we just didn't know what was going to happen for us in the future at that point. Here, Lochhead is emphasising the fact that sometimes events happen in our lives and that we have no way of realising just how significant and important they are going to be in the future. So far, we've had 2 stanzas where the poet is referring back to her childhood and her memories of Hogmanay one year. And then we have a reference to the Hogmanay party at which she and her now husband met. And now she's focusing on the present day for when she's writing the poem, so the 1980s. And she mentions the rituals that the city goes through, the city of Glasgow, reference to the setting there, on Hogmanay evening. The off-licences, which sell alcohol for taking home, are pulling down their shutters so that people can get home to be with their family. A quick aside, normally in UK English, this would be spelt with a C here, but online the poem was spelt with an S. Moving on, there's another reference here to the new year, which is reflective of the interstitial nature of the theme of Hogmanay, with time passing, and there are many references to the passing of time. And there's a more specific reference to the parts of the city here, high-rises and tenements, which implies perhaps the working class areas of the city. Time is referenced once again with this sunburst clock's tick phrase here, and the sunburst clock was very much typical of the 1960s and 70s, so would no doubt be still hanging on walls in the 1980s. And the sound is effective here. The consonance of the k sound helps to create the sound of the clock ticking, and tick itself is onomatopoetic. The idea of the mantel shelves having been dusted is once again hinting at the fact that everybody was getting prepared for this big moment in Scottish tradition. As the 4th stanza continues, there's a reference to everyone, which helps to establish a sense of community, which is very much to the fore in the city of Glasgow. The point that she's making is that everybody at New Year wants to try and do their best to move forward and to celebrate this chance of a new beginning effectively. There's a repetition here of the lines that appeared earlier on in the poem, reminding us of the Scottish tradition that you must be ready to welcome in the new year. And this is emphasised by the use of the split infinitive here, splitting to hope, drawing it to our attention. Moving forward, there's a contrast here, quite a lightness of touch between sickly liqueur, a fine drink, where you're trying to put on a bit of a show, and the booze in the alcove, a much more familiar vernacular term. And as we approach the end of the poem, there's a fabulous image, golden crusts on steak pies like quilts on a double bed, comparing the quilts on the bed to the beautiful sheets of pastry perfectly cooked on the steak pies, which are traditional fare to eat on New Year's Day in Scotland. The reference to double bed is appropriate in the context of a love poem because of the intimacy that it suggests, and it also harks back to earlier on when her mother laid out her good dress ready for Hogmanay on the candlewick, which is a bedspread. The end of the poem is very reflective and quite to the point, and this is where we live, Lochhead says, a short, blunt sentence summing everything up, emphasising the moment that we are in and where we are. She concludes with, "There is no time like the present for a kiss, reminding us that while it is interesting to reflect back on years bygone and to look forward, don't miss the opportunity to enjoy the present moment. And finishing with a kiss is very evocative of the concept of the love poem, which is introduced at the start. Lochhead's use of structure as the poem comes to a close is very effective. We have the monosyllabic short sentence here, and we also have the enjambment, which places the word present here at the beginning of the final line. And there's almost the feeling that being given this opportunity to enjoy the present is a gift that we must appreciate. With regard to form and structure, the 4 stanzas are written in free verse, which conveys the sense of movement, which is appropriate for the theme of moving between the past memories and the present day. The tone varies across the poem, starting off as matter of fact and admiring as she observes her mother, becoming reflective at times, hopeful at others, and becoming intimate in places as would be appropriate for a love poem. I hope that's been helpful. See you next time. In other videos, we analyse more of Liz Lochhead's poems. If you found this or any of our other videos useful, it would be great if you could subscribe to the YouTube channel. Thanks for your support.